the bitter winter of 1944, the forests of Western Europe echoed with the roar of engines and the thunder of steel. Across snow-laden hills and shattered villages, two machines of war prepared to face each other in one of World War II's most decisive armored duels. On one side stood the German Panther, sleek, powerful, and feared by every Allied tanker who'd ever seen its long 75mm gun flash. On the other stood the American Sherman, mocked by the enemy, underestimated even by some of its own men. They called it the Ronson, a lighter tank that lights up the first time. Every time. The Germans laughed at it until something changed. In the final months of the war, the US Army introduced a secret weapon hidden in plain sight, a new high-velocity 76mm gun, loaded with experimental HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition. Suddenly the weak Sherman could punch holes through the invincible Panthers that once hunted it. It wasn't just an upgrade, it was revenge forged in steel. This is the story of that transformation, of the crews who fought against impossible odds, of engineers who defied conventional wisdom, and of the moment the battlefield balance shifted. From the mud of Normandy to the frozen hell of the Ardennes, the Sherman's 76mm gun became the equalizer that turned laughter into fear. Through eyewitness accounts, battlefield reports, and the haunting echoes of tank combat, we revisit the moment the German Armored Corps learned a brutal truth. The Americans had caught up, and their so-called inferior Sherman was now a predator. This is the Germans laughed at the 76mm Sherman until its HVAP rounds tore through Panthers like paper. In the summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy were littered with burned-out tanks, the twisted steel skeletons of war machines that once thundered with power. Among them lay the remains of dozens of American Shermans, their hulls blackened, their guns silent, their crews either dead or captured. The smell of cordite and burning oil hung thick in the air. Across the hedgerows, the sound of German Panthers echoed like thunder, their engines deep and menacing, their crews confident and ruthless. This was the battlefield where reputations were made and destroyed. For American tank crews, the Sherman was both a lifeline and a curse. It was fast, reliable, and easy to repair, but it was never designed to face what it was now up against. The Panther, sleek and lethal, was the culmination of years of German engineering mastery. Its 75mm KWK-42 gun had a muzzle velocity of nearly 1,000 meters per second, capable of slicing through a Sherman's armor before the American crew even spotted their attacker. Its thick-sloped armor could shrug off most Allied shells with ease. The first encounters between Shermans and Panthers were devastating. On June 8, 1944, just 2 days after D-Day, a column of Shermans from the U.S. 4th Armored Division moved cautiously through the bocage, the thick, hedgerow-lined fields that turned Normandy into a death trap. As they rounded a corner, 3 Panthers emerged from concealment. The Americans fired first, their 75mm shells ricocheting harmlessly off the German tanks. Then the Panthers returned fire. Within seconds, 2 Shermans were burning, their crews scrambling out through hatches as flames consumed their tanks. The 3rd Sherman managed to retreat, its turret ring jammed, its gun useless. Stories like that spread fast. Tankers began to whisper that their Shermans were coffins on tracks. British soldiers nicknamed them Tommy Cookers because they said they lit up as easily as a cigarette lighter. The German crews even joked about it in their reports. Die Amerikanischen Panzers in Spielzeug, they called them. The American tanks are toys. To many Allied soldiers, that cruel mockery rang true, but there was more to the Sherman than the Germans realized. Beneath its vulnerabilities lay a machine that embodied the American way of war, adaptable, mass-producible, and relentlessly persistent. While the Germans poured their resources into creating mechanical masterpieces like the Tiger and the Panther, the Americans focused on something different: numbers, mobility, and reliability. For every Panther that rolled off the line, the US could produce 5 Shermans. That imbalance alone changed the battlefield. Still, quantity couldn't mask the fear that haunted every Sherman crewman when he faced a German tank. Veteran tanker Sergeant William Knapp of the 2nd Armored Division recalled, "When you saw a Panther, your stomach just dropped. You knew if he saw you first, that was it. You'd get one chance, maybe. Crews relied on teamwork, coordination, and often sheer luck. They learned to flank, to move fast, get around the Panther's front armor and hit it in the side or rear. A Sherman might not win in a head-on duel, but in a coordinated pack, it could still kill. American tankers became hunters by necessity, stalking their prey through forests and villages, using terrain to their advantage. Infantry and artillery support became crucial. Sherman crews learned to call in airstrikes when they couldn't win with guns alone. Every trick, every ounce of cunning was a tool for survival. And as they adapted, so too did their commanders. General Omar Bradley, watching the bloody progress in Normandy, demanded an answer from the Ordnance Department. He wanted firepower that could stand toe-to-toe with the German armor. Back in the United States, engineers had already been working on that very solution. They knew the Sherman's biggest flaw wasn't its armor, it was its gun. The 75mm cannon that had served well in North Africa and Italy was simply too weak for Europe. So they designed a replacement, the 76mm M1 gun, with higher muzzle velocity and improved armor-piercing capability. When paired with advanced ammunition, it could turn the tide of armored warfare. Yet by the time those new guns began reaching the front, the damage to morale had been done. Tankers were skeptical. They'd seen too many friends die inside burning Shermans to believe in promises from the rear. They told us the new gun would even the odds, one crewman from the 5th Armored Division later said, but we'd heard that before. Out here, the only thing that evened the odds was luck. Even so, whispers of change spread through the ranks. A handful of Shermans equipped with the new 76mm gun began to appear in the summer of 1944. Crews noticed the difference immediately. The longer barrel, the sharper recoil, the deeper, more powerful sound when it fired. It was a new voice on the battlefield. The question was, would it be enough? In the chaos of battle, that question was answered in blood and fire. In late July, near the French town of Saint-Lô, a platoon of Shermans encountered a column of Panthers, advancing along a narrow road. The Americans fired first. For the first time, a Sherman's shot didn't bounce off. The HVAP round, a tungsten-cored high-velocity shell fired from a 76mm gun, struck a Panther squarely in the turret, punching clean through. The German tank exploded, its turret flying into the air. The American crews were stunned. They fired again. Another Panther went up in flames. In that moment, everything changed. The laughter, the mockery, the fear, all of it began to fade. The Germans had underestimated the Shermans, and now they were paying for it. But before the 76mm and its HVAP rounds could dominate the battlefield, the men who fought in those early brutal days of Normandy had to endure unimaginable losses. They learned the hard way that courage wasn't about having the best machine. It was about fighting on when every logical reason said to stop. They fought not just against German steel, but against the very myth of invincibility that the Wehrmacht had built around its armored might. Those early days of struggle set the stage for what was to come. The evolution of a tank once mocked into a weapon the Germans would soon learn to fear. The laughter was dying down, but the real reckoning was only beginning. By the late summer of 1944, the Sherman's new 76mm gun had begun to appear in greater numbers across the front lines of Europe. It was the result of months of frustration and desperation, born from the experiences of tank crews who had watched too many of their friends die in machines that could barely scratch the armor of a German Panther or Tiger. Yet, even with the new weapon, the confidence of the American tankers didn't return overnight. They were hardened men now, cautious, pragmatic, and deeply aware of the stakes every time they rolled out of cover. One of them was Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Gaines of the 3rd Armored Division. Just 24 years old, Gaines had already survived the Normandy breakout and the brutal fighting at Saint-Lô. His Sherman, nicknamed Lucky Lady, was one of the first to receive the upgraded 76mm M1 gun. It looked nearly the same as the old model, but Gaines could feel the difference the moment he fired it. It kicked like a mule, he later wrote in his journal, but it spoke with authority. You could tell it meant business. The men of his crew, Sergeant Harper, Corporal Diaz, Private Fields, and Gunner Jack "Trigger" Thompson, had all grown used to the feeling of being outmatched. They'd seen what the German Panthers could do. Harper, the loader, had once joked that the Panther wasn't a tank. It was a moving nightmare wrapped in steel. Every time they went into battle, they knew that even the slightest mistake could mean their death. That summer, near the French town of Falaise, Gaines's unit received orders to block a retreating German column. The Wehrmacht was withdrawing east, desperate to escape the tightening Allied encirclement. Intelligence suggested the column included several Panthers. Gaines and his men prepared for what they knew could be a suicide mission. As the dawn mist lifted, they rolled out across the open countryside. The air was heavy with the smell of diesel and gunpowder. Gaines's heart pounded as he peered through the periscope. "Keep your eyes open," he whispered over the radio. "They'll come from the tree line." Minutes later they saw movement, dark silhouettes creeping through the morning haze. Panthers. 4 of them. Their long barrels pointed like spears toward the American line. The German tanks moved slowly but deliberately, confident in their armor, unaware that the Shermans they were facing carried a new and deadly secret. "Range? 800 yards, Thompson said, adjusting his sights. Gaines didn't hesitate. "Fire!" The first round screamed across the field. It struck the lead Panther squarely on the glacis plate, and this time it didn't ricochet. The tungsten core of the HVAP round punched through the armor like a knife through cloth. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its turret. "Hit confirmed," Thompson yelled. For a brief moment the Americans couldn't believe it. The invincible German armor breached in a single shot. Then chaos erupted. The remaining Panthers turned their guns and fired. Dirt and debris exploded around the Shermans as shells slammed into the ground. Gaines ordered his driver to flank right, moving fast, using the terrain for cover. Another HVAP round was loaded, the loader's hands moving in a blur. "Target second tank, left side of the road," Gaines commanded. Thompson fired again. The second Panther erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of violent explosions. The German formation was thrown into confusion. Their confidence shattered. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes, but for the men inside Lucky Lady it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, 2 Panthers burned fiercely, their hulls split open, and a third lay disabled in a ditch. The fourth retreated, firing wildly as it withdrew into the woods. As silence fell over the field, Gaines leaned back in his seat, stunned. "We did it," Harper whispered. "We actually did it." For the first time since Normandy, the men of the 3rd Armored felt the balance shift, even if only slightly. They had proof that the Sherman could kill a Panther, that the Americans could finally fight back on even ground. Reports of the engagement spread quickly through the division. Word traveled from one unit to another, often exaggerated but always carrying the same message. The new gun worked. The laughter from the German crews, the arrogance that had colored so many of their encounters, was fading. But it wasn't just about the gun. It was about the men who used it. American crews began to rediscover their confidence. They trained harder, learned to coordinate their attacks, and started to adapt their tactics to take advantage of the 76mm's new capabilities. Instead of charging headlong into German ambushes, they fought smart, ambushing the ambushers using terrain, smoke, and speed to catch the enemy off guard. Lieutenant Gaines and his crew became minor legends within their battalion. Their kill count rose, but so did the danger. The Germans were no longer dismissive. They were angry, determined to crush this new threat. Gaines's unit began to encounter more organized defenses, and German gunners learned to target Shermans with the long barrel, knowing those were the ones that could now punch back. Still, morale among the American tankers soared. There was a new sense of pride, a feeling that they were no longer running from the enemy but standing their ground. For men who had lived for months under the constant shadow of fear, that change was everything. In his journal, Gaines captured the moment perfectly. "We used to look at the Panthers and feel small. Now we look at them and think, we've got something for you too. It's not arrogance, it's relief. For once we have a fighting chance." That fighting chance would prove crucial in the coming months. The Germans were far from finished. Their armor was still deadly, their tactics still brutal. But now every Sherman that rolled onto the battlefield carried with it a new kind of hope, forged not in factories or laboratories, but in the fire and terror of battle. The 76mm gun and the deadly HVAP rounds it could fire didn't just give the Americans better firepower. It restored something far more important: belief. The belief that they could win, not just by numbers or by luck, but by skill, courage, and the sheer will to keep fighting. And that belief would soon turn the laughter of German tankers into something else entirely: fear. As autumn 1944 descended upon Europe, the war entered its bloodiest, most desperate phase. The Allied advance was grinding forward, but it was anything but easy. Every hedgerow, every ruined village, and every crossroads seemed to conceal another ambush. The Germans, though weakened, fought with the fury of cornered beasts. They knew the terrain, they knew the tactics, and they still possessed some of the most formidable tanks the world had ever seen. The Panther, the Tiger, and their variants that seemed almost supernatural to the weary soldiers who faced them. For the American tankers, the new 76mm armed Sherman was a mixed blessing. It was better, faster and deadlier, but it was still far from perfect. The armor remained thin, and even with the high-velocity rounds, most crews knew that a head-on duel with a Panther or Tiger was still a death sentence. The key was to outthink the enemy, to use the terrain, the light, the element of surprise. Lieutenant Gaines and his crew had learned that lesson the hard way. In the weeks following the Falaise victory, their unit pushed east toward the Siegfried Line. The closer they got to Germany, the fiercer the resistance became. The Luftwaffe was largely gone, but the Wehrmacht fought on with machine-like efficiency. They had lost much, but they still held the advantage in armored duels. One foggy morning in early October, Gaines's platoon was tasked with securing a small village near Aachen. Reconnaissance reported enemy armor in the area, possibly a few Panthers covering the retreat of German infantry. The town sat in a shallow valley, with narrow streets and stone houses perfect for ambushes. Gaines studied his map and muttered, "If I were a Panther commander, I'd sit right there, behind that church." Covering the road, they approached cautiously. The Shermans moving in a column, their engines humming low. The fog was thick, rolling across the fields like smoke. Every shadow could be death. Harper, the loader, whispered, "Feels too quiet." Gaines agreed. His gut told him something was wrong. The first shell struck without warning. It came from the churchyard, exactly where Gaines had predicted. The lead Sherman erupted in fire, its turret blasted off and landing upside down on the cobblestones. The second tank reversed instantly, but the narrow street trapped it. Panic set in as the Americans tried to locate the enemy through the haze. "Panther 11 o'clock, Thompson shouted. Gaines spotted it, the dark outline, the long barrel glinting through the mist. "Range 600 yards, he said, steadying his breath. "Load HVAP." Harper slammed the round into the chamber, his hands trembling. "Up," he yelled. Gaines aimed and fired. The 76mm roared, the recoil shaking the tank. The shot struck the Panther's lower hull, just above the tracks. Sparks flew, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Then smoke began to pour out from the German tank's engine deck. "Hit," Thompson shouted. The Panther shuddered but didn't die. Its turret turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Gaines's Sherman. The two tanks stared at each other like predators circling for the kill. Back up, Gaines yelled. The driver threw the tank into reverse, just as the Panther fired. The German shell screamed past them, slamming into the side of a building and sending chunks of stone flying. "Load again!" The next round was ready. Gaines re-aimed and fired once more, this time at the turret ring. The HVAP round struck true, tearing through the armor. The Panther stopped moving. Its gun drooped. Flames burst from the hatch as the German crew tried to escape. One figure climbed out, covered in soot, only to collapse on the cobblestones. The village echoed with explosions as other Shermans joined the fight. German infantry fired Panzerfausts from windows, but American soldiers moved in behind the tanks, clearing buildings one by one. Within 20 minutes, the battle was over. 3 Panthers lay destroyed. 2 Shermans were burning. Gaines's crew sat in silence. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. Harper wiped soot from his face and said quietly, "They're not laughing anymore." That engagement marked a turning point for Gaines's division. For months, they had been on the defensive in tank duels. Now, they were hunting the hunters. The Panther was still a terrifying enemy, but the Americans were learning how to beat it through teamwork, coordination, and the deadly precision of the 76mm HVAP round. In the days that followed, reports came in from across the front. Similar victories were being recorded at Aachen, Nancy, and Metz. Sherman crews that once dreaded the sight of a Panther were now meeting them with grim determination. A tank commander from the 4th Armored Division described it simply, "We stopped fearing the German tanks. We started planning how to kill them." The psychological shift was enormous. The German tankers, once smug in their superiority, began to feel the sting of uncertainty. For years their armor had ruled the battlefield, but now the Americans were closing the gap. Supply shortages worsened their situation. German crews often found themselves without enough fuel or spare parts, while the Americans had endless replacements and new ammunition. Yet, victory never came easily. The price of every destroyed Panther was paid in blood. Gaines lost 2 close friends in the following weeks, both tank commanders caught in ambushes. For all their progress, the Sherman crews knew they were still fighting uphill. The Panthers might be fewer now, but they were still deadly. Every engagement was a gamble. Every kilometer gained came with the cost of lives. One night, while bivouacked near the front, Gaines wrote in his journal, "We don't fight for glory or medals. We fight to stay alive. We fight for the guy in the next tank. And every time we see one of those black crosses burning, it feels like a little justice for everyone they took from us." As autumn gave way to winter, the war grew colder, harsher, and crueler. But the tide had turned. The laughter that once echoed from German tank crews was gone. In its place came silence. The silence of men who had finally met an enemy that could match their steel with equal fire and unbreakable will. The Shermans were no longer running. They were advancing. And with every battle, the world's most underestimated tank and its underestimated crews were proving that courage, adaptability, and sheer determination could overcome even the most fearsome machine of war. Winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold so bitter that even the steel hulls of the tanks seemed to groan in protest. The Ardennes forest, thick and silent under a blanket of snow, hid within it one of the deadliest surprises of the war. The Germans, thought by many to be beaten, launched a massive counterattack in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a desperate gamble, Hitler's final attempt to split the Allied lines and turn the tide once more. For the men of the US Army, including Lieutenant Gaines and his crew, it was a nightmare reborn. In those early days of the offensive, the German war machine roared back to life. Panthers and Tigers surged out of the forest like phantoms, ambushing convoys and decimating isolated positions. The skies were grey, grounding Allied aircraft, and the dense fog made reconnaissance impossible. To many American units, it felt as though the ghosts of 1940 had returned, the invincible German Panzers, cutting through everything in their path. Gaines and his crew were stationed near Bastogne when the first reports came in. Entire columns had been wiped out by German armor. The roads were clogged with refugees and retreating vehicles. "They're coming fast," Sergeant Harper muttered as they listened to the radio chatter. "Whole divisions. And they've got Panthers leading the way." The Sherman crews prepared for what they knew would be their toughest fight yet. They dug in along a narrow forest road, positioning their tanks behind natural cover, frozen logs, snowbanks, and the charred remains of vehicles from the previous day's skirmishes. Their 76mm guns were loaded and ready, but they all knew what those guns would be up against. Just after dawn, the sound began, deep, rhythmic, like a drumbeat echoing through the fog. The ground trembled beneath their boots. The enemy was coming. Gaines raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Through the mist, the silhouettes of Panthers emerged, massive, ominous shapes moving in a line. He counted 5, maybe more. "Hold fire," he ordered quietly. The crews waited in tense silence, their breath freezing in the air. The German tanks moved closer, unaware of the Americans lying in wait. The snow muffled every sound. Then, as the lead Panther crossed into range, Gaines whispered the words his gunner had been waiting for. "Fire!" The 76mm gun roared, shattering the silence. The HVAP round streaked through the cold morning air and slammed into the Panther's side armor. Sparks burst, followed by smoke. The tank lurched to a stop. A second later, flames erupted from its turret. The Germans reacted instantly, their cannons swinging toward the sound. "Move!" "Relocate," Gaines barked. The Sherman's engine roared to life as they backed into cover. A German shell screamed past, detonating nearby and showering them with snow and dirt. "Load HVAP," Harper shouted, slamming another round into the breach. Gaines's crew worked like a machine, each man knowing his role, each motion practiced to perfection. Another Panther appeared, firing as it advanced. Its shell tore through the trees, splintering trunks like matchsticks. Gaines maneuvered Lucky Lady to flank it, weaving through the woods. They came to a clearing where they could see the enemy's exposed side. Fire! This time the shot struck true. The round punched clean through the Panther's hull, and it exploded in a violent burst of flame. The blast lit up the forest, casting eerie shadows across the snow, but there was no time to celebrate. Another shell hit nearby, the shockwave slamming into them. The Sherman rocked violently. "We're hit!" Thompson yelled, though the armor had held. "Minor damage, we're good," Harper shouted back, already loading another round. All around them, chaos erupted. The battle became a deadly dance of fire and steel. German infantry with Panzerfausts closed in through the trees, only to be cut down by American riflemen. The air stank of fuel and burning oil. Gaines's radio crackled with frantic calls. Other tankers reporting losses, asking for support. Some voices suddenly cutting off mid-sentence. For hours, the fight raged. Every time a Panther appeared, the Shermans fought it off with desperate precision. The 76mm guns, once doubted, now proved their worth again and again. They couldn't always destroy a Panther outright, but they could disable it, break its treads, and force the crew to abandon it. Each German loss was a small victory, a reminder that the Americans could stand their ground. As dusk fell, the forest grew quiet again. The smoke hung low over the snow, and the ground was littered with the twisted wrecks of tanks from both sides. Gaines climbed out of his Sherman, the cold air biting his face. He looked around at the devastation, the burning hulks glowing orange against the white snow. 2 of his platoon's tanks were gone, so were dozens of his friends. Harper stood beside him, his face blackened with soot. "You think it's over?" he asked. Gaines shook his head slowly. "No, but we held." They had held the line, something that seemed impossible only months before. The Sherman, once mocked, once feared by its own crews, had stood up to the most feared tanks of the German army. The combination of courage, coordination, and the deadly HVAP rounds had turned the tide of countless small battles like this one. In the following days, as reinforcements arrived and the weather cleared, the American counterattacks began. The skies filled again with Allied aircraft, and the German offensive started to crumble. The Panthers that had seemed unstoppable were now being hunted, not by fear but by experience. For Gaines and his crew, the Battle of the Bulge was more than just another engagement. It was proof that even in the harshest conditions, the American spirit, resourceful, unyielding, and stubbornly brave, could endure anything. They'd faced the full might of the German armored divisions and survived. When night finally fell, Gaines wrote a few words in his notebook, his handwriting shaky from exhaustion. "They laughed at our tanks. They called us amateurs, but they're the ones burning now. The snow glows with their fire." The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as one of the most brutal confrontations of World War II. But for the men inside those Shermans, it was something more. It was vindication. Their so-called inferior tanks had stood against the Panthers and Tigers and lived to tell the tale. And with every enemy tank they left smoldering in the snow, they buried the myth of German invincibility a little deeper. As the winter thawed and the roads of Europe turned from ice to mud, the tide of war shifted for good. The American forces, battle-hardened from the chaos of the Ardennes, began to push eastward with renewed ferocity. Their Shermans, once derided, once mocked, were no longer retreating from the fight. They were leading it. The men who commanded them had learned through fire and fear how to turn the Sherman's weaknesses into strengths. And with the introduction of more powerful ammunition like the HVAP rounds, the battlefield equation was beginning to change. By the spring of 1945, the German war machine was running on fumes. The mighty Panthers and Tigers that had once terrified Allied crews were fewer in number, hampered by fuel shortages and constant mechanical breakdowns. But even in decline, they were still dangerous, and nowhere was that clearer than in the Siegfried Line, the last formidable defensive belt before the heart of Germany itself. Lieutenant Gaines and his crew, men who had fought from Normandy through Belgium, now found themselves staring at the thick concrete Fortifications that guarded the German homeland. Bunkers, tank traps and anti-tank guns covered every approach. Yet unlike the early days of the war, the Americans now advanced with confidence born of experience. They had seen what worked, and they had learned to fight smarter, not just harder. On a misty morning near the town of Remagen, Gaines's unit was ordered to advance toward a ridge suspected to be guarded by German armor. The ground trembled faintly as their columns moved forward, a low mechanical heartbeat of engines and treads. "They'll have something waiting for us," Harper muttered, scanning the horizon through the periscope. "They always do." He was right. As the Shermans rolled over the rise, flashes erupted from the tree line ahead. German guns opened fire, and the first shells screamed past, detonating behind them. "Panthers, 11 o'clock!" Thompson shouted. Gaines swung his turret, his pulse hammering. "Target front! Load HVAP!" The first HVAP round tore from the barrel, the recoil jolting the entire tank. It hit the lead Panther dead on the front plate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a burst of fire exploded from its engine deck. The crew inside never stood a chance. The men in Lucky Lady cheered, but their triumph was short-lived. Two more Panthers moved into view, their cannons flashing. One shell slammed into a Sherman on their left, sending its turret skyward in a column of smoke and flame. "Keep moving. Don't stop," Gaines shouted, maneuvering between the burning wrecks. The battle descended into chaos. Shells cutting through the air, tracer rounds streaking like fiery comets, smoke obscuring everything. The once quiet fields were now a furnace of destruction. Despite the German tanks' superior armor and guns, the American crews used terrain and teamwork to their advantage. They flanked from cover, fired from hidden positions, and relied on coordination through radio chatter to outmaneuver their foes. "Tank 3, suppress that ridge!" "Tank 5, get to the flank," Gaines commanded. The response was instant. They'd become a single living machine, a coordinated weapon of steel and willpower. A second HVAP round found its mark, piercing through another Panther's side armor and detonating its ammunition. The explosion was deafening, the heat searing even from a distance. Smoke billowed high, casting long shadows over the field. The Germans fought back fiercely, their discipline never wavering, but the Americans pressed on relentlessly. Hours passed like minutes. When the guns finally fell silent, the once pristine ridge was blackened and littered with twisted hulks of steel. Panthers, Shermans, and half-tracks burned side by side, enemies in life, equals in destruction. Gaines's crew sat in stunned silence. Harper's hands were trembling as he lit a cigarette. "Hell of a day," he muttered. Gaines just nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The cost was immense. Many of their comrades wouldn't make it home. Yet every battle like this brought them one step closer to victory, one step closer to ending the nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 long years. That evening, as they set up camp on the outskirts of a captured village, the men listened to the distant thunder of artillery echoing from the Rhine. The war was nearing its end, but none of them dared to believe it until it truly came. They sat by their tanks, their homes, their shields, their weapons, and shared what rations they had left. The air was cold, but for the first time in months the firelight felt almost warm. Nearby, children from the village peeked out from behind doorways, their faces thin and pale. Harper tossed one his last chocolate bar, and the boy smiled shyly before vanishing back inside. It was a small gesture, but it reminded them why they were there, why they fought through the mud. The fire and the fear, for Gaines. The war had become something personal. Not about nations or flags, but about survival and brotherhood. He thought of the men they'd lost, of the fields of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and now these German hills. Each battlefield told the same story, of courage forged under fire, of ordinary men doing the extraordinary. He leaned against the Sherman's hull and looked up at the stars, just beginning to pierce the smoky sky. "You know," he said quietly, "they used to say our tanks couldn't win against theirs. That we were outgunned, outmatched." Harper chuckled softly. "Yeah," he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Well, someone forgot to tell us that. The war would rage for a few more brutal weeks before Germany finally surrendered. But by then, the legend of the 76mm Sherman had already been written. Not in textbooks, but in the memories of the men who fought inside them. The Germans had laughed once, dismissing it as weak, as obsolete. But laughter had long since faded into silence. drowned out by the thunder of its cannon and the roar of its defiance. And as the stars shone above the battered countryside, the surviving crews knew one thing for certain. They hadn't just fought history's deadliest tanks. They had beaten them, one burning Panther at a time. The war in Europe was breathing its last ragged breaths. It was the spring of 1945, and the once feared German war machine was collapsing under the combined weight of Allied might and its own exhaustion. Cities were in ruins, divisions shattered and morale shattered beyond repair. Yet in the final weeks the fighting remained savage, desperate, even fanatical. And for the crews of the Sherman tanks, there was no sense of victory yet. Only the grim routine of advancing through destruction. Lieutenant Gaines's unit was among those pushing deeper into Germany, crossing shattered bridges and burned-out villages as they closed in on the Rhine. Every day brought new danger. Even as the German army crumbled, small pockets of resistance fought with suicidal determination. Remnants of SS units, Hitler Youth, or old men with Panzerfausts hidden in basements. Gaines knew that one careless move could still end everything. The once hated Sherman tanks were now veterans of countless engagements. Their crews had turned them into lethal instruments of war, knowing how to angle armor, how to move under fire, and how to exploit every second between a German gunner's aim and their own shot. The introduction of HVAP rounds had changed everything. They no longer felt helpless when a Panther appeared on the horizon. The piercing hiss of those rounds had given the Shermans something they'd long lacked: respect. But as the Americans neared the heart of Germany, the emotional toll became heavier. They passed through towns reduced to rubble, where civilians wandered like ghosts. The smell of smoke and death hung over everything. Harper, usually quick with a joke, had grown quiet. "Hard to believe anyone's still fighting for this," he murmured one evening, as they drove past a street lined with ruined homes. Gaines nodded silently. "They've got nothing left but pride," he said. "And that's the most dangerous thing in a fight." A few days later, near a small industrial town on the edge of the Ruhr, that danger became very real. As their column advanced along a narrow road flanked by factories, the lead Sherman suddenly erupted in flames. A massive explosion shook the air, the unmistakable strike of an anti-tank shell. The Germans had hidden a Panther inside the shadow of a warehouse, its barrel perfectly camouflaged among the debris. "Panther!" "9 o'clock!" Gaines shouted. "Back up, smoke out!" But the road was too tight, the space too narrow. Gaines's Sherman had to fight where it stood. "Load HVAP!" Harper barked, already slamming the special round into the breech. The gun thundered, the recoil slamming through the hull. The shell screamed across the short distance and struck the Panther's side. A flash, then sparks. It glanced off, leaving only a scar. Ricochet. "Adjust 2 degrees, right?" Gaines yelled. The loader grabbed another HVAP round, sweat streaming down his face. "Up!" he cried. Gaines fired again. This time the impact was devastating. The tungsten core sliced through the Panther's turret like a knife through steel, and the explosion that followed sent shrapnel and smoke pouring from every hatch. The German tank burned, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of fiery bursts. The men inside didn't stand a chance. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and the soft patter of debris falling on steel. Gaines's crew sat motionless, adrenaline still surging through their veins. Harper exhaled slowly, staring at the inferno. "Guess the HVAP got the last word," he muttered. It was just another skirmish, one of countless encounters in a war defined by mechanical fury. But for Gaines and his men, it felt symbolic. The moment when the hunter had become the hunted, when the underestimated had finally triumphed over the mighty. As they moved on, they encountered more surrendering Germans, weary, hollow-eyed men too tired to fight. Entire convoys of soldiers laid down their arms, their commanders gone, their hope extinguished. The mighty Wehrmacht had been reduced to scattered remnants, trying to survive the inevitable end. When the surrender finally came in May 1945, Gaines's unit was camped on the outskirts of a small town south of Hanover. The radio crackled with the news: "Germany has surrendered unconditionally." The words hung in the air, almost surreal. For a long time, no one said a word. Then Harper laughed, and not out of joy but disbelief. "So that's it," he said quietly. After all that, Gaines didn't respond. He simply looked at his tank. the battered Sherman that had carried them through hell and back. Its once green armor was pitted, scorched and streaked with soot. It had been their home, their shield and their weapon. He placed his hand on the steel hull. "She made it," he whispered. In the days that followed, the men tried to adjust to peace. They cleaned their tanks, wrote letters home and helped distribute food to the civilians who had survived. For the first time, they saw the Germans not as enemies, but as human beings, hungry, broken, terrified people who had suffered as deeply as anyone. One afternoon, as Gaines walked through the town square, he noticed a young German boy staring at the Sherman parked nearby. The boy pointed to it and asked, "Ist das der Panzer, der die Tiger besiegt hat? Is that the tank that beat the Tigers?" Gaines smiled faintly and nodded. "Yeah, kid," he said softly. "That's the one." Years later, veterans like Gaines would recall how everyone used to mock the Sherman, how they called it a death trap, how they said it stood no chance against German armor. But the truth was more complicated. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of the war, but it was the right tank, reliable, adaptable, and above all there when it mattered most. It wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. The HVAP rounds had given it teeth, yes, but it was the men inside who gave it a soul. They learned to fight with ingenuity, courage, and stubborn resolve. They faced fear every day and they kept moving forward, through Normandy, the Ardennes, and into Germany itself. And so, when history looks back on the laughter of the German crews who once dismissed the Sherman, it remembers what came after, the thunder of its guns, the courage of its men, and the sight of Panthers burning under Allied fire. In the end, the Sherman didn't just win battles. It proved a point, that war isn't always about the biggest guns or the thickest armor. Sometimes it's about heart, about grit, about the will to fight when all logic says you shouldn't. And that's what turned a laughable tank into a legend that rolled right into history and never stopped moving forward.